Ghost Story, the old maternity hospital, to help you fall asleep.
This particular account took place in the mid to late 1970s. I was still a relatively newlywed to my first husband, Bill. Bill worked on and off, but mostly off. Therefore, I had to work. I found employment as a nurse aide in a fairly large hospital, leaving out the name, in Willoughby, Ohio. I started there in 1974 and worked until 1977. We had moved from our first apartment due to the fact that it was haunted to a very nice apartment in Euclid. However, having moved further away made it harder to commute to my job. So I had to secure new employment closer to our new residence, making it easier to transit back and forth. I found work in another hospital called Booth Memorial Hospital. It no longer exists. They didn't have any openings for nurse aides, but needed housekeepers. I figured, I'm not too proud. Work is work, and a paycheck is a paycheck. They hired me. I started there in the latter part of '77. Let me supply a little background on this hospital. It originally opened as a charity maternity hospital in 1902 and was expanded upon in 1904. They also opened a home for unwed mothers in 1907 that was operated with the hospital. It was called Booth Hospital at first, and the unwed mother's home was separate and built slightly adjacent to it, on the right side of it, behind the hospital. The hospital's name officially changed in 1923 to Booth Memorial Hospital. It was named after William Booth, founder of the Salvation Army, who operated the facility. It was originally a small hospital, having only 54 beds when first opened, but when I went to work there in 1977, it had 3 floors and about 100 beds by then. Low-income families could also go there to have their babies, and they could temporarily house the husbands and other children of the women patients, thus allowing them to be close by. The unwed mother's home had 3 floors. The girls living there were expected to do chores to earn their keep. They also were given education and job training in the event that they decided to keep their babies. For the most part, though, back in the 1900s, 1950s, unwed females were often viewed by the state as unfit mothers. Thus, the children became wards of the state and were placed in foster homes or adopted out to middle-income families that could afford to raise and educate them and the like. You have to understand that it was a much different time period, and they frowned on unwed mothers back then. We scarcely raise an eyebrow about single parents nowadays, but back then it was a whole different mindset. I could tell that the building had a lot of history behind it by the architect. I met and made immediate friends with a woman I'll call Trish. She was a divorcee with a young son. Her ex wasn't giving her any child support, so she had to work to make ends meet for her son and herself. Back in the 70s, the state didn't go after men to make support payments like they do now. Trish and I often worked together on the same floors. We encountered many SA personnel with their navy blue uniforms on. They had captains, sergeants, and corporals. Not unlike the military, they mostly operated the home out back, but would come to the hospital to assist the nursing staff with the patient, or to work in the nursery. They had 3 nurseries, 1 on each floor. We had utility rooms to store our carts supplies in on the first floor. There were about 4 utility rooms, 1 in each wing. We had additional storage for our supplies down in the basement. Like I said, Trish and I connected and got along right away. My first couple weeks there, Trish would always insist on our going to the basement together, and not alone. I didn't really question her about that, as I thought she was just being concerned about my getting lost down there. That was a definite possibility, since it was a maze of hallways with a multitude of rooms on either side of the halls. Not to mention the shippings, receiving docks, boiler rooms, kitchen supply, housekeeping articles, and yes, the morgue was located down there. We could access the basement via the elevator or the stairwells. However, I learned quickly where everything was located. One day, I was headed toward the elevator to go down to fetch some supplies when Trish noticed me and asked me where I was going. I told her I was just going to the basement to get some things for the utility room. She told me that she'd come with me. I exclaimed that she needn't bother since I knew my way around down there. But she insisted. About then, she piqued my curiosity and I asked her why. She said she'd explain after we got what we needed and came back up. We got our supplies and came back to the first floor, at which point I awaited her explanation. She invited me into the lounge because she said we could talk better in there. The lounge was empty. We seated ourselves on a couch by the window. She then let out a nervous sigh and told me that her reason was because strange things have happened to her when she went down there alone. I must have read her mind because I said, "You're going to tell me there's a ghost down there? Am I right?" I was met with a stunned silence for a split second, and then she nodded her head. She told me not to think she was crazy, but something happened to her that frightened her to the point that she won't go there alone. I told her that I did not think she was crazy because I had my fair share of paranormal encounters myself. I asked her to tell me what happened. Trish had already been there a couple years when I started. She said that shortly after she started working there, that she went to the basement to get supplies one day. She wasn't thinking of anything except getting what she needed and getting back to the floor to work. She had collected a bag full of items and turned around to head back towards the elevator when she saw a young woman with blondish hair staring at her with a startled look on her face. She noticed that she could almost see through the woman. Trish screamed and dropped her bag and ran full steam ahead to the elevator. When she reached the first floor, she grabbed a security guard and pleaded with him to escort her back to the basement. He could see that she was visibly shaken, so he didn't ask any questions. He just went with her downstairs to retrieve her bag of supplies and bring her back up. Trish said the guard must have thought she was either certifiable or just an hysterical woman. She didn't care, but felt better when he went with her. By this point, Trish was wringing her hands nervously. I told her to calm down. I told her that she shouldn't so much fear the ghost as the living are much more of a problem. I was attempting to inject a little levity into the situation to get her to relax. She wasn't amused. I explained that the woman was once a living, breathing person, and possibly her life was cut unexpectedly short by a medical mishap. After all, this is a hospital and people do die here. Not very pleasant. Basak. She then eased back onto the couch with an understanding grin on her face. She said that she still did not want to go down there alone, but wanted to know if we talked to the ghost if it would help. My reply was that we'll find out the next time we head that way. Of course, the situation arose when we needed more supplies again. We went together. Trish wouldn't have had it any other way. I introduced ourselves to our unseen hostess and explained that we were not there to harm or bother her, but we merely needed some important items so we could do our work. We began gathering some supplies when Trish sounded annoyed and announced that all the paper towels had been moved. They were always in a specific spot on a certain shelf. Now she couldn't find them. We conducted a search of every shelf and could not locate the much-needed paper towels. By then I was slightly exasperated. I wanted to know what idiot moved something that we go through so fast and absolutely needed to find. After that statement, we both heard a muffled but heavy thud on the floor several feet behind us. Trish let out a small shriek, and I admit that I gasped. However, when we looked behind us, there on the floor was a large banded-together carton of paper towels. I uttered a special thank you to our unseen benefactor for her kind assistance. I told her that we never would have seen them way up on the top of the shelves where they were, had she not helped us. It may have been my imagination, but I almost thought I heard a soft feminine voice respond saying, "You're welcome." I'm not sure, but I thought I heard it. We complained to our supervisor when we got back to the floor. We told him that we would have to be 7 feet tall to see where those paper towels were moved to. We told him that we used a long broom to knock them down to retrieve them because we thought a ladder would be too shaky for either of us. He apologized and promised to have them placed back where it would be convenient and safe for us to access. No way were we going to tell him that a ghost helped us to get them. Not too sure he'd buy that. This is a continuation of my last post regarding a very old maternity hospital built in 1902 and was operated by the Salvation Army, named after their founder, William Booth. The hospital operated until it closed in 1991. I worked there as a housekeeper in 1977. They apparently had a female ghost that resided in the basement of the facility. A fellow employee, Trish, is the one who told me about it. We had a brief encounter in the basement while trying to find some paper towels to stock the utility room upstairs. The ghost brought a case of them down off a shelf that was so high up that neither of us could even see them. Therefore, this woman ghost helped us locate exactly what we were trying to find. We thanked her. After that episode, we didn't seem to hear or see her again. Possibly she finally moved on. Kitty Corner behind the hospital was the unwed mother's home that housed the girls' women until they had their babies. The home was primarily where the SA personnel worked. They ran the offices, made the meals, taught school courses, and did job training for the girls. I used to go outside, sometimes for my lunch break, and walk around to unwind before going back on duty. On some of those occasions, I would be looking at the home. I would notice an older woman come out of the side onto the concrete stairwell outside of the building. She would then descend the steps and go over to a little brick outbuilding that housed old furniture, and what have you. She wore the traditional navy blue uniform with a blue cap on her head that the SA personnel wore. I never gave any thought to it. I knew that the Salvation Army personnel operated and worked over there. So no big deal. I thought it was no big deal. She looked rather matronly with her graying hair pinned back. She always seemed focused on doing a specific task. She didn't even notice me standing in front of the building, and I saw no reason to disturb her from whatever she had to do. Nurse told me, "Did you ever notice the side door of the home open or close when that woman walked out?" Now that you mention it, I don't think I have, I replied. The nurse asked me again, "Did you ever see her walk through a door on the side of the outbuilding she went into?" It took me a while before I noticed those seemingly innocuous little details. But once I took note of what I was seeing, it dawned on me that I was seeing something far from normal. Trish and I were on the hospital's second floor cleaning one time. A couple SA captains came walking through chatting with the nurses, asking about how many beds were occupied, how the nurseries were doing, if there was anything they were needing that they could order for the stations, that kind of thing. After talking to them, they gravitated over to Trish and me. They were very polite. They asked us how we were doing. Did we like working there? Pretty much just casual small talk, after which they departed to go to another area in the facility. We still had more work to do, though. We entered the nurses' lounge to begin cleaning in there. Trish did the waste baskets while I cleaned the restroom, and we both began dusting the lockers and mopping the floors. We were having a conversation about the facility and the other floor we had left to clean. I wondered why we never had to go to the home in back of the hospital to clean over there. Trish told me that the girls, women that reside there are responsible for doing that, though we were not required over there. Neither Trish nor I had ever been in the home, but we wondered about it in our conversation. I told her about the uniformed lady that I kept seeing over there. About that time, one of the nurses came in to retrieve an item from her locker. She overheard me describing the lady I kept seeing. She got a funny expression on her face and went over to the door and closed it. She then introduced herself to Trish and I. She inquired about the lady I was talking about. I told her what I'd noticed frequently about the woman, how she comes out of the building down outside steps and goes into the little brick outbuilding. I described her to this nurse, who began getting a little pale. She told me that she had seen this woman periodically. But what was the big deal? The following is the conversation relating to this woman that we saw. This is where it got interesting and a little bit scary. She told us that she was embarrassed to discuss it with her coworkers, so she did some research on her own. She knew a nurse that regularly worked over in the home. She asked questions, but was trying not to sound ridiculous. Apparently, the nurse that worked over there figured out what the questions were leading to. This other nurse confided in her that she was seeing Sister Doris. Suddenly, the inquisitive nurse felt a bit sheepish. So, she was seeing a lady that works there. The reply she received just about floored her. The other nurse told her that Sister Doris had passed on over 50 years ago. Her picture was on the hall wall inside as one of the dedicated Salvation Army personnel that devoted her life to the well-being of those who enter here. In other words, she was really seeing the ghost of Sister Doris, and so was I. She told her that Sister Doris was a saintly and kind woman. She never bothers or hurts anyone. In fact, they were very fond of Sister Doris. Say what? I could scarcely believe what I was hearing, that they didn't mind sharing the home with a ghost. According to the nurse we were talking to, she said the unwed home nurse told her that Sister Doris is extremely helpful over there. Sometimes she straightens out the beds for the girls/women, or they'd get done doing laundry and leave to gather more, only to come back and see sheets, towels, and what have you neatly folded. Some of the girls were even comforted by Sister Doris, a few times not realizing she was non-corporeal. Of course, the people working over there weren't about to tell them. Sister Doris would go outside to bring in extra supplies that were needed inside the home. The little brick outbuilding was once where the supplies were stored. Sister Doris often volunteered to go out there to bring in whatever was needed, quite often. She was the type of woman that always went above and beyond in everything she did. What a lady. When the nurse got done telling us this, all I could say was, apparently, the good Sister Doris wished to remain in her capacity as a caregiver and comforter. She wanted to continue serving a needful purpose even in the afterlife. They agreed with that scenario. I commented how very solid and real she appeared. I admit that was my first experience seeing a solid-looking, full-bodied apparition. I worked there for 2 years and saw Sister Doris sporadically until I secured a better job elsewhere. But I wasn't alarmed at seeing her anymore. She was a fine lady. I never confided those incidents to Bill. He was the type that wouldn't really believe it unless he saw it with his own eyes. Even then, he would be a bit of a skeptic. I maintain a practical sense of rationale in regard to what I have encountered. I will evaluate all the logical possibilities before I concede that something is truly paranormal. Once you eliminate the logical, then what remains is beyond logic and should just be accepted as such. There is an unseen world around us, if we only acknowledge it. Something to think about. That concludes this.